The following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
If you remember, on August 21st, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, two things happened simultaneously and played out on live television on our network and in every other place, it seemed. And that was Paul Manafort was convicted in that first trial he had down in Virginia, and Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's former fixer, cut that plea deal. Those two things happened at the same time. And it seems to have unleashed a sort of continuous cycle of, even by the standards of the Trump presidency, even by the standards of this unusual era in American politics, it seems to have unleashed an unusually chaotic period of several weeks in our politics. That Cohen-Manafort news that sort of overwhelmed everything else was quickly followed up by the events surrounding the death of John McCain and the president's initial refusal to honor him, the whole controversy with lowering the flag, raising the flag, and then the contrast just between sort of the way the sort of media world, political world, the way a lot of people in general reacted to the legacy of John McCain, the life of John McCain, and the contrast with President Trump, it seemed to hurt him as well. So you see a continuous sort of drop. Started with Manafort and Cohen, continued through McCain. And it's continuing now. I mean, just look at the news in the last day. Now you've got part two with Paul Manafort. Now you've got news of Paul Manafort cooperating. You've got Donald Trump last week, questioning the official study on the number of deaths, for the hurricane in Puerto Rico, saying it's a hoax. There's just been even by the standards of this presidency, a level of chaos the last few weeks that seems to have tracked with a drop in his poll numbers. We took at NBC a poll that actually finished up on the 21st of August. And we polled President Trump's approval rating, and we got the numbers on the 21st, literally hours before the Manafort and Cohen plea. And Donald Trump's approval rating in that poll was 46%. And 46% was the highest approval rating Donald Trump had in our poll since he had been president. And it was one of the highest approval ratings you had measured in any poll of Donald Trump since he'd been president, especially if you moved outside of the first 10 days of his presidency, when he had his own version of a honeymoon and he got to 48% in a couple polls. That's where Donald Trump was in our poll on August 21st. And in this average of polls on August 21st, he was sitting around 44%. In other words, he was sitting right where Republicans said they needed him to be to have a real shot at holding the House and maybe to accomplish a little bit more for them. And since then, again, in the average, you say, 3 points or so is the drop. It's not a huge number, but by the standards of this presidency, it's a significant number. Because this is a president who's not been much higher than the mid-40s his entire presidency, president who's not been much lower than, about 36%. It's been a very, very narrow window. And the difference in terms of the electoral fortunes of the Republican Party and the electoral fortunes of Donald Trump himself, between Trump being at, 38% and Trump being at 44%, those differences are potentially vast. Just given the sort of polarization we have right now, the scant number of true, authentic swing voters that are left, to have that kind of drop, to have the drop we've seen in the last few weeks is significant. To put this in a little bit more context, we say 23 seats needed for the Democrats to get control of the House. How has presidential approval rating tracked with this in past midterm elections? So I'll give you an example here on one end where you can see there are two exceptions since World War II, two exceptions in modern history where a president's party has actually not lost seats, but gained seats in a midterm election. And you can see them right here, 2002 and 1998. What do they have in common? Each time the president's approval rating was over 60%. George W. Bush in 2002, we were a year out from 9/11. His approval rating had hit 95% in one poll immediately after 9/11. It was still very high a year later, and you can see that tracked with a Republican gain of 8 seats, House seats, in the 2002 midterms. Bill Clinton in 1998, of course, the parallel drama in the 1998 campaign was the drive by Republicans who controlled the House to impeach Bill Clinton. They took the vote 1 month before Election Day in 1998 to open a formal impeachment inquiry. Polls showed voters were against that by a 2-to-1 margin. Bill Clinton's approval rating kept rising. The economy, there were lots of positive economic indicators around then. Bill Clinton's approval kept rising. 66% it hit on Election Day. Democrats gained 5 seats on Election Day. So traumatic was that for Republicans in 1998 that within days, Newt Gingrich was ousted. He was overthrown as the Republican Speaker of the House, and a whole bunch of sort of drama and chaos ensued from that, which you can read about in my new book. But you can see, I mean, what exceptions these are. Not only are these the only 2 times, but look how relatively minimal those gains are. I mean, these are examples where politically everything was breaking right for the president and for the president's party. And it's shocking to see a gain at all. 8 seats and 5 seats. On the flip side, when you're not in that sort of rarefied territory for a president in a midterm election, when your approval rating is more Trumpian, take a look at the flip side of it. Here's what we've seen just in the modern times since Reagan's presidency. The 2 headline examples we all remember, Bill Clinton, he was actually at 46% in 1994. They call that one the Republican Revolution, a 54-seat loss. You look at George W. Bush in 2006, he was down at 36%. Remember, Iraq was spiraling out of control. Katrina had happened a year earlier. 31-seat loss. Republicans lost the House in 2006. 2014, Obama was down at 40%. You say 13, well, it wasn't that big a number, is because Democrats didn't have much left to lose in 2014. By losing 13 seats in the 2014 midterm election, Democrats fell to their lowest level in the House since before the Great Depression. So the high watermark for Republicans since 1928 was attained by the 2014 midterm with Barack Obama at 14%, Ronald Reagan at 82%. Similar story. Unemployment hit 10% a month before that election. Reagan's approval was 43% on Election Day. That 26-seat loss for Republicans. Remember, 1982, they were calling it the permanent Democratic majority in Congress. Republicans didn't have much to start with, so a 26-seat loss back then was something close to catastrophic for them. So again, we're seeing double digits, sometimes way, way, way into the double digits, the losses that come with an approval rating, 40, 36. Clinton's 46 was from Gallup. If you actually had averaged his poll numbers together around then, it would have been a little bit lower, 43 for Reagan. And there's Donald Trump right now, clocking in at the moment in the low 40s. So the opportunity is clear there for Democrats. And the question, I think the single biggest question hovering over this midterm, if you want to reduce it to one big question, it's where's Trump's approval? When we get to Election Day, are we looking at polls that show there's been a mild but significant rebound for him? Are we seeing polls that put him back at 44, 45%? If we are, I think there's a path there for Republicans to hang on to the House. If we're seeing polls like we're seeing now, if we're seeing polls that are even worse for him, where he really enters into Bush 06 territory, it just becomes very, very difficult to see those 23 seats start to add up very quickly for Democrats. And especially when you look at it this way, 23 seats Democrats need. There are 25 across the country right now. 25 seats that are controlled by Republicans right now, but that Donald Trump lost he lost the district in the 2016 election. So it's sort of the first line of attack for Democrats as they look to the House. Districts where the voters already didn't like Trump, already turned on Trump. In some cases, you were looking at 20-point shifts from voting big for Romney in 12 to voting for Hillary Clinton in 16. And they reelected their Republican member of Congress in 2016. But Democrats say, hey, 2 years in, those are the voters who are most potentially ripe for a message of, hey, maybe we're going a little too far here. Maybe we need a check. So the numbers just there, just in that first line, they line up for Democrats. And there's other opportunities that present themselves for local reasons, for reasons of scandal around some politicians, for reasons of Democratic enthusiasm. Any district we're looking at around the country where there is a significant sort of suburban area, more white-collar professional. We always talk about these college-educated voters. We just saw this out in Ohio in a special election over the summer. The district that Donald Trump had carried by 11 points in 2016. Double-digit win, pretty comfortable. It's Columbus, it's the northern part of Columbus, and the immediate suburbs outside of Columbus. It's half the district in terms of population. The other half of the district, it's Trump country. It's blue-collar, non-college, it's rural and small city, like Zanesville, Ohio, for instance. Population-wise, that's half the district. In 2016, that added up to an 11-point Trump win. There was a lot of enthusiasm in that Trump part of the district. They held the special election for Congress over the summer. The margin for the Republican was 0.4%. Why was that? It was all about the enthusiasm, the energy, and the turnout in the immediate Columbus suburban area of the district. That's where you're seeing energy across the country right now. And you take a district like that, you introduce that energy as a variable, you raise the possibility that Republican energy might be reduced a little bit, districts like that start to come into play. So that's the House side, and I want to get to the Senate very quickly too, because I said we spent so much time talking about the House, but what about control of the U.S. Senate? So on paper, easy for Democrats, right? We're talking about big gains in the House potentially. We're talking about a 40% Trump approval rating. They're at 49 already in the Senate. They only need a net gain of 2. The problem for the Democrats basically is they are way, way, way overexposed in this class of senators. 1/3 of the Senate up every 6 years. This is a class of senators. It was a big year for Democrats in 2012, the last time they were up. It was a big year in 2006. That was the anti-Bush year. They actually had a very good year in 2000. George W. Bush won the presidency, but Democrats, the key Senate races broke to them in 2000. And so just years of Democratic success with this class have added up, and there just aren't many opportunities on the map for Democrats to make gains, and there are a lot of opportunities for them to lose. So take a look at, this is what I mean in terms of opportunities for them to lose. 10 Democratic senators you see here, all running for re-election this year. All of them have one thing in common. Their states voted for Donald Trump in 2016. These are Trump states with Democratic senators running in 2018. So Democrats, to have a chance to get over, to get to that 51 seat mark, they need to defend most of these. They can probably afford to lose 1, maybe 2, depending on how they do elsewhere, but that's it. That's a lot of turf to defend for them. And as we say, in terms of targets, take a look at what's emerging kind of as the battleground. So the red states you see there, Nevada, Arizona, Tennessee, and we've added Texas. Those look like the targets for Democrats. Those look like the Republican-held Senate seats where Democrats have a chance to win, to flip it, and to make gains. The blue ones from that group of 10 I just showed you, these are the ones that now, as we start to see polling, look like Democrats are in some degree of danger. In some cases, like North Dakota, I would say North Dakota is the single most likely Democratic seat to go. We've seen multiple polls out of North Dakota right now, North Dakota, that show Heidi Heitkamp, the Democratic incumbent, losing, being challenged by Kevin Cramer, who represents the state at large in the House district. We've had a couple polls out of Missouri. There was one yesterday. There was our own NBC poll 10 days ago, showed it dead even. Claire McCaskill, she drew a very weak opponent in 2012. Some people say she was lucky to win that race. Dead even in Missouri. State Donald Trump won by 20 points. Go down to Florida. This is the surprise. This is the Senate surprise of the cycle. Donald Trump won the state by just 2 points in 2016. Bill Nelson, Democratic senator, has been there since 2000. Turns out, as this campaign has played out, Florida is very polarized. We knew that. Nelson may not have the incumbency advantage we expected, and his opponent, Rick Scott, the governor of the state, a lot more popular in his second term than he was in his first term, than he was when he ran for re-election. So we've seen polls that are at best for Democrats in Florida dead even, and a number of polls that actually have shown Rick Scott ahead right there. So you just, again, if the Democrats need a net gain of 2, you could see, hey, let's say they win Arizona. That's probably their single best pickup opportunity there. Kirsten Sinema, multiple polls have shown her ahead. One yesterday put her up 7 points out there. Let's say they get Arizona. Let's say they get Nevada. Let's say they get Tennessee. Crazy, 26-point Trump state, open seat. Democrats nominated a former governor, Phil Bredesen, who's very popular, had a couple polls putting him ahead there. Let's say Democrats pick up those 3. You're saying, oh my God, there it is, 52. They're 1 seat over the majority. All right, you lose North Dakota, you're down to 51. You lose Florida, you're down to 50. 50-vote Senate, Mike Pence breaks the tie. That's how the geography is stacked against Democrats. I have to say, at the start of this cycle, we didn't think that in the middle of September we'd even be having this conversation, though, about the path that exists for Democrats. It's a narrow path. It's a steep path. But we can say, sitting here in the middle of September, the path is there. And again, I'll close on this because I know I'm probably going way over here. But the key number, anytime you get a poll in these states, they're coming out all over the place right now. Obviously, you look at the head-to-head, but then take a look at President Trump's approval rating. And it is uncanny how much that approval rating tracks with the fortunes of these Republican candidates. So in terms of the Senate, in terms of the House, even in terms of key governorships up this year, the single most important variable to look at, I think, is Trump's approval. Then you start looking at candidate quality, some sort of local factors. There are races that will defy gravity. But Democrats right now, I think just given where Trump is, given what the map looks like, it would be a big, big disappointment for them if they don't take back the House. And the Senate, I wouldn't say the odds are in their favor, but it's in the conversation right now.
We have time for 2 quick questions, then have to get Steve back over to NBC to get on the air. If there are any questions?
Isn't a more relevant question what the president's approval rating is in each one of those states as opposed to the national average, which includes states like California and New York?
Yeah, no, totally. So when I say the approval rating, the fluctuations you're talking about, where he'll be much more popular in North Dakota or West Virginia than he will in New York or Florida, it's kind of baked into that national calculation. Republicans kind of feel if he's sitting at about 44-45% nationally, that's going to indicate that in those states where they need him to be really high, it's ticked up those few critical points. Whereas if he's fallen to about 38%, again, it'll track with that in those key states as well. So it's sort of, yeah. I mean, if you want to, I encourage everybody to spend as much time as they possibly can with data. So if you want to go to each individual district and each individual state and look, that is a better method. But if you want the one catch-all number that captures the essence of it, I'd say it's Trump's approval rating.
And then if I could ask a final question, there's been a lot of attention to hard to reach voters in terms of polling, and sort of are the polls really picking up on kind of the sentiments that's out there and who's going to vote. Do you feel that's accurate? Have you guys changed your methodology? And do you think there's a version of this where who actually votes feels very different than what the polling is saying at this time?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking the what about 2016 question, I think. Look, 2 quick things I could say about that. Number one, what was the polling failure in 2016? Why was that such a surprise? It was not the national polling. It was not the Trump-Clinton national number. She won the popular vote, by a couple points. The average of the national polls on Election Day was a couple points. So if you took a national poll in 2016, it basically got it. Where was the failure? The failure was in those 3 states we talk about all the time, in particular, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and in states with population dynamics similar to those. And what I'm talking about here, large populations of motivated, say, blue-collar, more rural and ex-urban white voters. There was a surge in turnout and enthusiasm among them in 2016, and I believe when you look back at the polling in those states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, there wasn't even a lot of polling in Michigan in 2016. The polling, I believe, missed that. So we were looking all fall of 2016 saying, nationally it was sort of, Clinton was ahead, Trump was sort of more stubbornly close through what seemed like cataclysmic events for his campaign. Was there a path? What's the path? And the path always, it was clear. If there was going to be a path, it's going to be that Rust Belt path. And we were saying, show us a poll in Wisconsin that's got Trump polling within a point. Show us a poll that's got it tied, that's got him ahead. And the polling consistently was showing Clinton, 5, 6, 7 points up out there. So I think that's where the shock, that's where the failure came from. In terms of what we're looking at in 2018, one big difference pollsters are starting to do right now is to release different models. When they don't just necessarily release one number anymore. We had a new poll come out today in a key House district. You take the traditional number. This is what we think the electorate would look like. This is traditionally what it looks like. Well, what have we also been seeing this year? We've been seeing a surge in these special elections in particular of Democratic enthusiasm. Okay, if you have a surge in Democratic enthusiasm in those areas, what would it look like? So you get a different readout that way. So I think there's a little bit more transparency on the part of polling right now. I know different pollsters have had different efforts to reach those voters who we're talking about not being reached in 2016, and we'll see.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn the stage over to our panel moderator, Errol Louis, and our distinguished group of Congress members. Each have a long list of accomplishments. I'm just going to mention a couple. Errol's well known to this room. He's the political anchor of Spectrum News New York 1, where he hosts Inside City Hall. He is the person we turn on and turn to every night to explain the city political landscape to us, and we're glad to have him back. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney has been a prolific sponsor and driver of important legislation through her 26-year tenure. She introduced the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act in the House, which has been a critical bill for tens of thousands of first responders, volunteers, and survivors, and it's one New York will be long grateful for many years. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, now in his 3rd term, has focused his energies and influence on bringing federal resources to underserved communities. At a time when it seems few are able to reach across the aisle, Congressman Jeffries partnered with a conservative Republican from rural Georgia to put forth the First Step Act, a criminal justice reform bill that helps incarcerated people get back on their feet and get a second chance. Congresswoman Grace Meng, also in her third term, sits on the powerful House Appropriations Committee. She's focused on supporting veterans and strengthening diversity in the U.S. Armed Forces. She also helped launch a caucus on children's safety, giving representatives new resources to share with parents and caregivers in their districts. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I want to just jump right in. I'll let the folks get seated, and we'll get right to the questions, and we'll leave some time for you to add your questions as well. Steve did have to run off, so now we can talk about why he's wrong about most of what he had. Now, I actually rely on him the way many of the folks in the room do for a real clear, succinct kind of analysis and overview, and of course we thank him for that. Let me start with you, Congresswoman Maloney. You, I think, are the only one on our panel who was here when the change of control happened in 2006. You were in office. Does this feel similar? Does this feel familiar? Is the House about to, control of the House about to change hands as far as you and your colleagues are concerned? Does it feel the same way?
I'd say that it feels the same way. If anything, it feels stronger. I ran in 1992, which was the so-called Year of the Woman, where I think it was 48 of us were elected and walked down the aisle to not get married, but be sworn into the United States Congress. It was a very exciting year. Record women were running. This year we have so many women running. It's beyond record. It's over 250 women are running, but more importantly, they're winning the nomination for their party on both the Democratic and Republican side. And there's some projections that we may elect as many as 100 new women in this Congress. Overwhelmingly, they are Democratic. And I'd say that many of the forces that sent 48 women to Congress in '92, including myself, are the same now. A tremendously energized women's movement that started with the Women's March, and then the Me Too and the Time's Up, and all of these other movements have projected a gender gap as high as 33-36%. It's huge. And when you put that on top of the generic, which is around 10, and just yesterday the 538 came out and gave Democrats an 82% shot of winning the election. Even the bettors are projecting 2-1 a Democratic majority. But I also have to always remember, Errol, 2016, where the same group, 538, gave Trump a 28% shot of winning. And of course, the 28% happened. So the 28 can happen. Even the 1% can happen. I was reading about a shark attack. There's a 1 in 1,000 chance it's one person being killed by a shark, but it happened last week on Cape Cod. So you never know what's going to happen in an election. And even though all the numbers are on your side, I remember Election Day in 2016, I woke up and read every poll I could find. Only one had Trump winning, and that was the LA Times. So
okay, I got you. Yep, probability can be
we've
yes.
got to have our A+ game out there, even
Right.
if we're at 82% for the Democrats.
It reminds me of the joke about the statistician who goes to the hospital and tells the injured person, on average, this didn't happen to you, right?
Yeah, right.
So Hakeem Jeffries, you've been involved in some of the messaging that the Democrats have tried to develop going into the midterm elections. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I was under the impression that not long ago there was sort of a shift that instead of a better deal and some of the different ideas and policies that were being developed, there was a kind of do whatever works approach that maybe is a little bit more fragmented. Where is the messaging, and with the kind of statistical support that you have, as we saw from Steve Kornacki, what are Democrats going to do to take advantage of it?
Well, thank you, Errol. It's great to be here with everyone and great to be here with my two distinguished colleagues. So we began the year in 2017 with an understanding that there was a blind spot that we had relative to the economic anxiety that the American people were experiencing, notwithstanding the fact that all of the numbers were trending in the right direction. And that related to the fact that we don't have, and it continues to be the case right now, an unemployment problem, but we have an underemployment problem. We have a wage stagnation problem. We have a retirement insecurity problem. We have Americans who feel like they're trapped in jobs that don't provide them with a comfortable living. Trump was able to capture that economic anxiety in different ways in 2016, and we didn't speak to that in a compelling fashion. And so, as you referenced, Errol, when we began the year, we felt it was important to develop an anchor in an economic agenda that was wrapped around what we called a better deal on a whole host of issues related to healthcare costs and infrastructure and child care and pension security. And that also gave us an ability, we believe as Democrats, to stay focused on pocketbook issues and not allow our messaging to distract into areas that tend to be more divisive and hurt our ability to capture the imagination of the American people. Toward the conclusion of this 115th Congress, we always knew that it was important for us to have a closing argument to the American people. And so at the end of July, as we were heading into the August recess, we developed what we call our For the People agenda. 3 words focused on 3 issues: lowering healthcare costs, increasing pay for the American people, anchored in a real infrastructure plan, not the fake one that Donald Trump and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have put forward, but a real infrastructure plan that would invest $1 trillion, create 16 million good-paying jobs, and really repair our crumbling bridges, roads, and tunnels. And then the third issue, cleaning up corruption in Washington, D.C., just to make government work for the American people. And we were always of the view that our candidates are going to have to run their own individual races. But we do see a real alignment between those 3 issues, which consistently rank as the top 3 issues on the minds of the American people: healthcare costs, wages, and/or the economy, and of course, cleaning up the mess that is in Washington, D.C. So that's our closing argument. We believe that For the People captures what we as Democrats are all about. We wake up each and every morning and we go to work on behalf of working families, middle-class folks, senior citizens, the poor, the sick, the afflicted. That's essentially who we are at our best, for the people. It's simple, it's capable of repetition, it's authentic in terms of who we are. It has implied contrast because as we fight for the people, the Republicans, in our view, have shown us who they fight for in terms of their effort to strip away protections for pre-existing conditions. The tax cut bill, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%, ripping children away from the arms of their parents at the border. We're fighting for the people. They've shown you what they stand for, and we believe that we're in a strong position to drive this message home. Okay,
thank you. Now, Grace Meng, Congresswoman, as a tax writer on the Appropriations Committee, I'd like to ask you, I guess, about the going from the national themes that Hakeem Jeffries was just talking about to some local issues that are of great concern here, namely state and local tax deductibility. Is there any prospect, can the people in this room trust that the Democrats, if in power, will revisit that question, will perhaps make some of the reforms that would make New York, in particular, whole again?
Well, thank you, Errol, and thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you on that specific issue to the association for speaking out against removing that deduction. The SALT deduction is something that's incredibly important for us here in New York. It's important for my constituents, and it's important for many folks around the country. And that is one of the issues that we need to focus on as we are going around the country talking to candidates. And I'm very thankful for Hakeem and the team for a unifying message and his emphasis in the importance of personalizing and localizing issues such as the SALT deduction. Being in the House majority is something that will be tremendously beneficial for our country and for us right here in New York. Appropriations Committee more so focuses on the actual funding of every single government agency. And there are specific issues that are coming up that will directly impact us and the resources that we receive. For example, legal services. For so many immigrants in our communities around the country, we have the ability to provide or to stop funding of horrible programs such as separating kids and parents at the border. The census, which Carolyn Maloney has worked a lot on. The census is something that will, if we don't have an accurate count, will harmfully, severely impact us in so many ways. We've collaborated with the city and state on the appropriating of funds for so many programs, including infrastructure. Just in my part of Queens alone, we've worked with the governor to help repair Long Island Railroad stations, for example, in Flushing, in Murray Hill, and opening up a defunct station in Elmhurst. So these are very local and personalized ways of why getting a House majority would be very beneficial.
Okay, for all of you folks, the starting point for Steve's presentation is something I think we've all noticed just from following the political debate these days, which is that the president looms over almost every race. I mean, we just went through state midterms last week in which the president was in almost every piece of literature. I mean, and it almost seemed humorous, down to, races for judicial delegates. And people were saying, make me a delegate to the Judicial Convention so I can fight against Trump. Is this a national race in that sense? I mean, is this a referendum on Donald Trump? And if so, does that leave the Democrats in a somewhat vulnerable position? Everybody likes to sort of see what they want in the numbers, but I took away from the Kornacki presentation that a 4 or 5 point bump in his approval ratings could mean the difference between victory and failure for the Democrats.
So, I can just say, just in my district, Trump polls 45%. And so thankful for Steve Kornacki's numbers on how the rest of the country feels. And so I very much believe that those numbers are credible. And that certainly provides the motivation, whether we're trying to win back the White House, the House gubernatorial seats, or local judicial delegate seats, like Errol mentioned. But it certainly is just one part of the strategy. The strategy needs to be improved organizing and making sure that we're reaching communities who traditionally have not felt like the party as a whole was reaching out to them enough. We have been able to see increased turnout across the country and even here in New York. And when, for example, when John Ossoff was running for Congress in Georgia, yes, we lost the election, but because of our unity and hard work and our national party, specifically the DNC, hiring organizers coming from those base communities who looked like those communities, who spoke their languages, 8,000 new voters were registered, and that will be very helpful in elections going forward.
I agree with Steve that the biggest determination in the midterms historically has been a referendum on the president. And I would say that that's very bad news for the Republicans because he was in the 30s recently. He's hovered around 40. So his standing isn't that great in the polls. But it's not just his standing. There are other factors, and I'd call it the math. Number one, the number of districts that Hillary Clinton won that are Republican. That's 25. That's our first line of attack, are those 25 Republican members that are sitting in Democratic voting districts. Again, I would say a great advantage to the Democrats are the number of open seats. over 50 Republican open seats, roughly 25 Democratic. And Republicans are leaving. Even Speaker Ryan is leaving town. So that bodes very ill for the Republicans, the number of open seats. I would also say that a wonderful wind at our back is the year of the women #2, with so many women marching, running for office, voting. The numbers of Republican women that are voting Democratic, the gender gap is the highest it's ever been in history. So there's a number of factors that are very, very helpful to the Democrats, not just the president's low standing. I didn't mean to compare him to a shark, but he is a low standing. But in any event, you have to remember in an election, we often say to each other that a day is a year. And at the very end, there can be things that come out of the blue, such as we saw in 2016 with the FBI report 11 days out from the election. There can be things you can't control that come out, but we all have to be on our A game with the messaging and the ideas that Hakeem put forward, and I think particularly the economic message, where the gap between the haves and the have-nots are growing, and the fact that we're not sharing the wealth with the American people, and that we have to do more for the working men and women who have had stagnant wages, and that the Democratic Party not only stood for health care and fighting corruption and cronyism, but also fighting for a fair wage for the American worker.
I think that the president's approval rating and the parade of horribles that we continue to see coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue will, of course, largely shape what takes place. But I think there's a bigger structural issue that the Republicans will not be able to escape, and that fundamentally the American people, I think, instinctively appreciate balance. And whenever they perceive the pendulum swinging too far in one direction, they often swing it back. And so this is a change election where you have one party in complete control of government. And what we've seen over the last 25 years is that whenever that has taken place, from 92 to 94, Democrats have complete control of government in 92 with the election of Bill Clinton. In 94, Republicans take back the House and the Senate. George W. Bush is reelected in 2004. They have complete control of government. In 2006, Democrats take back the House and the Senate. Barack Obama is elected in 2008. Democrats have complete control of government. We lose the House in the very next midterm election. And, there was perceived overreach amongst Democrats on health care version 1.0 in 1992 through 1994. Certainly perceived overreach with George W. Bush and what he attempted to do with privatizing Social Security, and then Katrina and the corruption scandals. But it all started with the privatization effort on Social Security after he was reelected. Perceived overreach, though the Affordable Care Act is much more popular now, which puts us in a good place. We're playing offense on health care, but certainly that was the case. Complete control of government amongst Democrats. And so, Errol, that's not going to change. And I think there's a real view amongst the American people, both because of the unwillingness of the Republicans, particularly in the House, to conduct themselves as a separate and co-equal branch of government with a constitutional obligation to serve as a check and balance on an out-of-control executive, and the substantive overreach in trying to strip away health care from millions of people, protections for pre-existing conditions, jam this unbalanced tax cut down the throats of the American people, that we're in a strong position to rebalance our democracy, which the American people often do.
Well, let's talk about the ultimate check and balance. I've seen polling that suggests for Republicans in general and the president in particular, one thing that gets the Republican base excited, energized, and mobilized is the prospect of impeachment. The notion being that even if some Republicans are kind of lukewarm on the president, don't like what they're seeing, are having a hard time with some of what's going on in Washington, the minute you talk about impeachment, it starts to feel like an attempt to reverse the results of the 2016 election, and folks want to come out and protect the outcome. There's been some disciplined messaging coming from the leadership, of which you are part, Hakeem Jeffries, of saying that let's not talk about impeachment. It's too early. We don't know the results of the investigation by the Justice Department. Let's get past the midterms and so forth and so on. But we're down to the wire now, and there are some members who talk about impeachment every day. There are some who talk about it not at all. There are people like Congressman Nadler, who, if I understand his seniority and ranking position, would actually potentially be in charge of such a matter if it does come before a new Democratic majority. What's supposed to be going on with that talk? What are you all talking about in conference? Is there a sentiment that we need to shut up about this? Is there a sentiment that we need to talk more about it?
Well, I think many of us in Washington call it the I word. And the view, I think, is that the only group of folks who want to talk about impeachment in Washington, D.C. are Republicans, because they don't have an affirmative message to run on. And so at the end of the day, to try to charge up and energize their base, they basically have developed a line of thought that if you hand control of the gavel to House Democrats, the first thing that they're going to do is try to impeach the president. We've said affirmatively what we are going to do is work on lowering health care costs, increasing wages, and cleaning up this mess in Washington, D.C. That's our clear message. And I think we authentically believe, one, that's the right thing to do for the American people, but also Carolyn helped to lead the charge along with Grace and others. We fought for Jeff Sessions to recuse himself, notwithstanding the fact we had no ability or power other than shaping public sentiment to force him to do so. He recused himself. We then fought for Rod Rosenstein and the Department of Justice to appoint a special counsel to investigate crimes that may have been committed by the Trump campaign. Notwithstanding the fact we had no ability to force them to do so outside of public sentiment, but when Trump fired Comey, he gave us the opening to shape public sentiment in a way where Rosenstein had to do it. And so we got the appointment of a special counsel and a phenomenal American in Bob Mueller. So I think our view is now we just have to let Mueller be Mueller, complete his investigation, report to the Department of Justice, report to the American people, and then at that point, we can let the chips fall where they may.
Grace, let me ask you something in particular about immigration. It strikes me that when, and I want to take a little bit of issue with what something you just said, Hakeem Jeffries, is that I think the Republicans do have a message to run on. The economy, by every indicator that matters to most people, is doing great. There's an inequality problem, no question about it, but unemployment is at record lows. As we all knew, the tax cut is going to be stimulative. If you care about your pension and you watch Wall Street at all, that seems to be going well. They have some things that they can talk about, but yet they don't. And this is what I wanted to ask you, Grace. In many cases, whenever I hear, in particular, talk about MS-13, talk about immigration, I think of it as potentially, at least, a wedge issue, because they think about immigration outside of New York very differently than the way we think of it here. And in those various couple of dozen districts that the Democrats want to take back and so forth, I'm wondering if it's going to play differently. I'm wondering if there's a different kind of conversation that's going on outside of New York that you're picking up as you talk with your colleagues.
I think that one area where you can give the Republicans credit for is that they tend to be very disciplined on their message, whether it is a wrong message or whether it is an accurate message. Most recently, when you heard about the young lady, Molly, who was killed in Iowa, for example, the Republicans have and they will continue to make that a big issue. And that, of course, will impact the congressional races, let's say, that we have there. However, in the days that those news stories came out, and Molly's father actually wrote a very heartwarming and compelling letter about how we should not label all Hispanics as MS-13 gang members. And so this rhetoric, of course, it will be pushed out by certain folks. But it's our job, again, not to be distracted. So in the days since those news stories broke, Abby Finkenauer, for example, from Iowa, her seat just got rated more likely to be a Democratic flip. So we need these candidates who are staying on message and talking about the issues that are important. So, of course, whether it's immigration or whether it's making sure that we are not just framing immigrants in a way that is stereotypically framed by these Republicans. Immigration is an issue that doesn't just affect the streets of New York City. It is an issue that is incredibly important to farmers, to folks in rural areas, to people, companies and colleges who are hiring more tech workers. And so it's our job to expand that narrative more accurately.
Is it potentially a wedge issue among Democrats? By that I mean, you talk about immigration in New York, you're going to get one answer. You talk about immigration in Pennsylvania or the Texas border or Arizona, you get a very different answer.
Right, and the issues are not cookie cutter. They're not exactly the same, even within the field of immigration. In a state like Texas, you'll be talking about the border much more than maybe other issues in states like New York.
Does Nancy Pelosi have the unified support of the conference, do you think? This is another one of those questions we keep hearing. Let's not talk about it just yet, but we all know that you all talk about it probably every day with your colleagues.
I would say that if we take back the House, I believe Nancy will be reelected. And I will say she has been a strong supporter of New York, the Second Avenue subway that had billions in federal money, the East Side Connector, the new L train, all of these, the Sandy recovery money, where she supported. But I particularly remember, and you cited it when I came up, or maybe it was Stephen who did, that the 9/11 health and compensation bill was a very difficult bill to pass. It took us 15 years to pass it, believe it or not. And it was a big boon to New York, brought $8 billion to our treasury to provide health care to our sick first responders and others. And we got it through the House, and no one thought we could get it through the Senate. I asked her, please keep the House open. It got through the Senate. Half of Congress had gone home, and we were on the phone calling my good friend Nydia Velasquez in Puerto Rico to fly back to vote for this bill, and others. Another one of my roommates was home in Michigan, and she flew back. We literally brought back the Democrats to vote for that bill, which was the right thing to do, to take care of the men and women who took care of us, but also it was incredibly important to the city of New York. Based on her record of supporting the people in the city and the state that I represent, I will be supporting her for Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, did you want to comment?
I think when that question was asked, both Grace and I were looking at Carolyn saying, seniority, you answer it first.
Put me on the hot seat.
I definitely associate myself with Carolyn Maloney's remarks. I strongly support the current leadership team, Nancy Pelosi, and I've said that the last thing that we as Democrats should do is engage in a family feud and a circular firing squad in advance of getting the job done on November 6th and taking back the House of Representatives.
I will say, if I could add something, putting aside the question of what exactly will happen, nobody knows. It's, as far as I know, Nancy Pelosi is running to be the leader again. However, I do think it's very important also as we welcome in the new slate of candidates and Congress members for the next congressional class, that we also have a diverse slate of leadership, and that we also are creating opportunities for newer and younger generations.
Me in thanking the Congress members and Errol for this great panel.